I was 8 months pregnant when I fled my own mansion in the middle of a raging storm. I left right after hearing my husband and my sister casually discussing a plan that would ensure no one would ever believe a word I said again. A plan designed to erase me completely. Out on the empty highway, a massive truck came speeding through the rain, heading right for me. But suddenly a man on a motorcycle tore through the storm. He intentionally crashed into the front panel of the truck, forcing it to swerve and saving my life. I rushed him to the hospital, his jacket completely soaked in blood. By the next morning, 3 black SUVs had surrounded the place where I was hiding, and the first words I heard that morning chilled me to the bone. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking around. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? What country, what city? Wherever you are watching this, your comment means more to me than any like. Just a quick note, parts of this story are fictional, created to entertain and provoke deep reflection. Any resemblance to actual names or places is purely coincidental, but the underlying message this story is trying to tell you that is completely intentional. There are moments in life that you can look back on and say, that was the line. On one side you are one person, on the other side you are someone entirely different. For me, that line was a slightly open door. It was a thin sliver of amber light spilling out from my late father's old study, and the sound of the voice belonging to the man I had built my entire life around. When my father was teaching me how to restore antiques, he used to tell me, the most dangerous forgeries are the ones that look the most real, Caroline. You only discover the truth when you look at what's underneath. He was talking about old objects. Bronze vases, painted porcelain, pieces altered with such careful precision that only an expert patient eye could find exactly where the lie began. I thought I understood what he meant, but I didn't. Not until that night. My name is Caroline Sterling. I'm 31 years old, and until 8 months ago I would have described my life as exactly what I had worked so hard for. I run the restoration division of Sterling Fine Arts, the company my father, Edward Sterling, built over 40 years, growing it from a single gallery on the Upper East Side into one of the most respected names in American private art. Collection. I am good at my job. I'm precise. I know how to look at something broken and understand what it used to be. I was also 8 months pregnant, which meant that for the last few weeks I hadn't slept through a single night. That night, it was a sharp pain in my lower back that woke me up. I put on my robe, left Grant sleeping, or what I thought was Grant sleeping, and went downstairs to the kitchen for water, hoping to find some combination of pillows and patience that would get me through to the morning. The kitchen was dark. The hallway was dark. But the study, my father's old study, which Grant had taken over after we got married and moved into the Sterling estate, had light spilling out from under the door. And then I heard Serafina's voice. My sister never came to the house at that hour. She had her own apartment in the West Village, and whatever complicated relationship she had with Grant, it had always stayed on the surface. Dinner parties, gallery events, the kind of closeness that looks like family but never quite feels like it. Hearing her voice near midnight behind a closed door, speaking in that low, deliberate tone of someone who absolutely does not want to be heard, that was what made me stop. I stood in the hallway and listened. The documents have to be filed before she has a chance to contest them, Serafina said. Grant replied, once the doctor's signatures are ready, we'll have 72 hours. Dr. Harmon is on board. He'll do it, Serafina confirmed. He owes me. I knew exactly what they were talking about. As the sole heir to Sterling Fine Arts, I had spent years working alongside our legal team. The language Grant was using: involuntary psychiatric evaluation, medical signatures, a 72-hour hold. That was Section 9.27 of the New York Mental Hygiene Law. Under that law, if 2 licensed physicians sign off on an involuntary hold, a person can be committed to a psychiatric facility for up to 72 hours. No court order, no judge, no hearing, no notice. I was 8 months pregnant. 72 hours in a psychiatric ward at this stage of my pregnancy wasn't just a risk. It was a life sentence. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I stayed in that dark hallway, my hand pressed flat against the wall to keep myself steady, and I listened until I had heard enough. Then I pulled out my phone, opened the camera, and held it up to the crack where the door hadn't fully latched. The angle was tight. The image was dim. I could see Grant's back, a stack of papers on the desk, the edge of Serafina's profile. It wasn't enough for a courtroom, but it was enough for me to know I wasn't imagining things. It was enough to know that what I had been feeling for months, that faint, persistent sense that something was wrong which I had blamed on pregnancy hormones and stress, had a name. It had a document, and it had an assisting doctor. I got the recording. Then I went back upstairs. I moved the way I used to move when working on a fragile antique. Slowly, with intention. No unnecessary movements. I took off my robe. I put on real clothes. I grabbed my wallet from the nightstand drawer, my car keys from the hook inside the closet, and the small personal folder I kept hidden behind my winter coats. It contained copies of documents I had quietly gathered over the last 2 months, for reasons I hadn't fully dared to admit to myself until that exact moment. Grant had installed a location tracking app on my phone 6 weeks earlier. I had found it. I didn't say anything because the second he knew I found it, any advantage I had would vanish. Calling my lawyer from inside that house meant Grant would know within minutes. I had to get out first. I walked down the hall toward the garage entrance, passing the glass display case near the stairs. It held 3 pieces I was currently restoring, including the Sterling Dawn, a 19th century Chinese export vase that had been in my family for decades. I paused for just a second, looking at it through the glass. Then I kept walking. The garage was freezing, smelling of motor oil and concrete. I got into my car, put the key in the ignition, and the headlights flicked on, illuminating the blank white wall in front of me. It offered no answers. I sat there for 3 seconds. Then I threw it in reverse. The rain hammered against the windshield the second I cleared the garage door. Heavy, immediate rain. The kind that doesn't build up slowly but just hits all at once. I pulled out onto the street and drove without a destination, because the only thing I knew for sure right then was this. The phone in my purse was sending my location straight to Grant's device. I had 15 minutes, maybe less, before he realized I was gone. 15 minutes to figure out what came next. If I had correctly calculated what was waiting for me on that road, well, I never could have calculated it. Later, much later, when I finally understood the full scope of what Silas had been doing for 8 months, he told me that Grant's contractor had sent a confirmation message that night. It was sent over an encrypted channel that Silas had been monitoring since the 3rd month of his watch. The message named the road. It named the time. Silas was already moving before I even reached my garage door. I drove aimlessly for the first few miles. Something I don't recommend when you're 8.5 months pregnant and your hands won't stop shaking. The rain had thickened until it felt almost solid. It made the road ahead look like a moving grey wall. I kept both hands on the wheel and told myself to just breathe. My father's voice came to me somewhere on the highway, the way his voice always did in the moments I least expected it. Take care of yourself first, Caroline. Everything else can be rebuilt. You can't. He had said that to me when I was 18, after I sliced my hand open with a restoration tool. It wasn't serious, but I kept working anyway, bleeding quietly over a 300-year-old lacquered box because I didn't want to stop. He had pulled me away from the table and said those words. Back then, I thought he was talking about the lacquered box. Right now, I wasn't thinking about boxes at all. I got off the highway at a roadside gas station. Fluorescent lights, 2 pumps, a 2-4-hour convenience store, with an exhausted clerk visible behind the glass. I walked in and found what I needed near the back. A prepaid phone and a hard plastic case. In the US, prepaid burner phones are sold legally with no registration required. No ID needed. No name attached to the purchase. I paid in cash, using the emergency $20 bills I kept folded behind my driver's license. 5 minutes later, I was back on the road. I called Grace from the new phone. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was already awake. Grace Moore had been my closest friend since we were 9 years old. For the last 6 years, she had been working night shifts in the ER at Manhattan General. The early hours of the morning were her natural habitat. Caroline. Her voice shifted the second she heard me. "What's wrong? I'll explain when I see you. I'm driving. I'm okay. You don't sound okay." "Okay enough," I said. "I just needed to hear your voice." She stayed on the line for another minute without asking questions. It's one of the things I've always loved most about Grace. I told her I'd call back soon, and I hung up. I kept driving. The road emptied out the further I got from the city. Fewer streetlights, fewer cars. The rain was still relentless, and visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet in front of my headlights. I was navigating almost entirely by instinct, and the faint white lines disappearing under my tires. That's when I saw the truck's headlights at the intersection. They were coming from the cross street on my right. No slowing down, no turn signal, no hesitation, just 2 massive white points of light growing fast in the dark, accompanied by the deep, roaring sound of a heavy engine moving at top speed. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left. My car skidded on the wet pavement. The back end fishtailed before I managed to wrestle it under control. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. For a split second I thought I had dodged it. And then, out of nowhere, from the left lane, straight out of the dark and the rain, a motorcycle cut a sharp diagonal line and slammed directly into the front quarter of the truck. The impact was never going to stop a vehicle that size, but it did exactly enough. The truck driver yanked his wheel purely out of reflex, the kind of human overcorrection that no amount of training can fully erase. At that speed, on that slick surface, in that pouring rain, physics did the rest. The back end of the truck swung out with a long, deafening screech of wet rubber. The tires completely lost traction. The entire rig tipped over and skidded sideways into the guardrail with a sound like a building collapsing in slow motion. The motorcycle was thrown completely off the road. I slammed on my brakes. My car skidded and came to a halt half on the shoulder, the engine still running. I sat there for 3 full seconds, both hands gripping the wheel, listening to the rain and the sound of settling, groaning metal. Then I got out. Before I walked toward the man on the road, I did one thing first. I called 911 from the prepaid phone. I gave the dispatcher the name of the highway, the approximate mile marker I had just passed, and a description of the overturned truck against the barrier. In New York, you are legally required to report an accident if you witness it. Leaving the scene without reporting is an offense regardless of your involvement. I wasn't leaving without making that call. The dispatcher told me units were on the way. I told her there was an injured man and that I was taking him to Manhattan General. She told me to stay on the line. I told her I couldn't. The man was lying face down on the wet asphalt about 40 feet away. Dark jacket, dark jeans, completely motionless. I hurried toward him as fast as I could, which, at 8.5 months pregnant, wasn't exactly fast, but it was all I had. I knelt beside him and put my hand on his left shoulder. The right side of his jacket was soaked with dark, thick blood. "Hey, can you hear me? Can you move?" He didn't answer with words, but his fingers pressed flat against the wet road, and with visible, agonizing effort he slowly turned his head and looked at me. Barely conscious, but there. "I'm taking you to a hospital," I said, "but I need you to help me. I can't lift you. You have to give me something." He blinked once. Then he started to push himself up. It took almost 3 minutes. I draped his left arm over my shoulders and braced my back against the open car door for leverage. I let him do the heavy lifting of standing up while I just maintained a solid anchor point. He didn't make a single sound the entire time, not one groan. But I could see what it was costing him in the tight clench of his jaw, the way he braced and released with every agonizing shift in weight. Twice I had to stop because a sharp contraction ripped across my abdomen. I had to stand there and breathe through the pain before we could keep going. Finally, he managed to slide into the back seat. I called ahead to the trauma unit at Manhattan General from the car. In the US, giving an ER advance notice allows them to prep a bay and have a trauma team waiting before the patient even arrives. In cases of massive blood loss or head trauma, it saves critical minutes. I gave them what I had. Adult male motorcycle collision. Severe, right? shoulder, laceration, possible concussion, intermittent loss of consciousness. Then I drove. I kept talking to him because the silence in that car felt like a weight I couldn't afford to let settle. About 10 minutes from the hospital, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was looking back at me, not with a glassy, unfocused stare, but with the complete, quiet attention of someone who had been watching for much longer than just this moment. His mouth moved. "Silas," he said, and then his eyes rolled back and he passed out. In the seconds before he lost consciousness, I saw his left hand move slowly, deliberately toward the inside pocket of his jacket. He pressed something in there once. Then his arm went completely limp. I didn't understand it then. I would understand it later. I stepped on the gas and didn't let up until I saw the hospital's glowing red signs. When I pulled into the ambulance bay at Manhattan General, I laid on the horn and didn't stop until several figures in scrubs came running out with a gurney. I stepped out into the freezing air, the noise, and the harsh white lights. And right in the middle of the organized chaos of rolling equipment and shouted instructions, I found the one still point in all of it. Grace was standing at the ER entrance in her scrubs. She was holding a loose clipboard at her side, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in 22 years of friendship. She looked like she was staring at a ghost. An ER waiting room at 2:00 a.m. has a very specific quality of light. Flat, fluorescent, glaring white. The kind that leaves no shadows and nowhere to hide. I sat in a hard plastic chair, my winter coat still on my hands, clasped tightly in my lap. I could see the dried blood on the knuckles of my right hand, right where I had pressed against Silas's shoulder to keep him upright. I didn't look away. I wasn't ready to look away yet. Grace sat down next to me. She didn't say a word. She just placed her hand over mine, warm and steady, just like she had done since we were 9 years old, sitting outside the principal's office waiting for my dad after I accidentally shattered a display case in the school lobby. 22 years of friendship teaches you exactly when words are the wrong tool for the job. We sat like that for maybe 2 minutes. Then she spoke in a low voice. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the study door, the amber light, Grant's voice saying the documents had to be filed before I could contest them. I told her about the burner phone, the rainy highway, the massive truck coming out of the intersection without slowing down or signaling as if it was supposed to be in a very specific place at a very specific time. I told her about the man bleeding on the wet asphalt, the 3 minutes it took him to stand up, and the single word he spoke before passing out in my back seat. I told her all of it in the flattest voice I could manage, because I knew if I let any emotion into my voice, I wouldn't be able to stop shaking. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked exactly one question. "Does Grant know where you are right now?" I shook my head. I changed phones. I didn't use the car's built-in GPS because it's linked to an app he has access to. I paid for the gas in cash. "Okay," Grace said. She nodded once the way she did when she was shifting gears. Not friend mode anymore. The other mode. The one that kept her highly functional during 1-2 hour trauma shifts. She stood up. "Stay right here." She was gone for exactly 4 minutes. I counted them. When she came back, she was holding a styrofoam cup of terrible hospital coffee. She knew I couldn't drink it because of the pregnancy, but she set it down in front of me anyway because the gesture was what mattered. She sat back down, and that was when the burner phone in my coat pocket started vibrating. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. No caller ID, no area code I recognized. Without thinking, I held it out to Grace the way you reach for the person next to you when something startles you in the dark. She looked at the screen. "Answer it," she said. I brought the phone to my ear. The voice on the other end was male. Calm, measured. It had the distinct cadence of someone who was very used to delivering information that other people found alarming. "Miss Sterling, my name is Robert Hall. I was your father's private legal counsel for 11 years. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to ask me how I know anything until I am finished speaking." I didn't say a word. He took that as permission to continue. "The man they just took into surgery is named Silas Thorne. For the last 8 months, under explicit instructions left by your father, he has been watching over you. What happened tonight on that highway was not an accident, and your husband is on his way to that hospital right now. Based on what I know of his resources, you have maybe 20 minutes before he walks through the doors. The waiting room didn't change. The fluorescent light was just as flat and white. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked open and shut. Everything around me carried on, completely ordinary, and yet sitting right in the middle of it, I felt the floor of everything I thought I understood tilt sharply to the left. "How did you get this number?" I asked. My voice came out much steadier than I felt. Silas sent it to me 7 minutes before he lost consciousness. He used a secondary device completely separate from anything registered in his name. He had a protocol in place for exactly this scenario, and that protocol included a way to contact me that didn't require him to be conscious to execute it. What scenario? A brief pause. Not hesitation. The calculated pause of a lawyer deciding exactly how far to open a door. The scenario where he could no longer protect you directly, and you needed to know you weren't alone. "Miss Sterling, I will explain everything to you, but not tonight, and not on this phone. Right now, the only thing that matters is that you are not inside that building when your husband walks through the main entrance." The line went quiet. Not disconnected, just silent, like he was waiting. I lowered the phone and looked at Grace. She was already looking past me, staring through the glass wall at the front of the waiting room that overlooked the main hospital parking lot. I turned and followed her gaze. A dark sedan had just pulled into the drop-off zone. The headlights were still on, cutting through the rain, streaking down the wet glass. Even from that distance, through 2 layers of safety glass, I saw the driver's door open. I saw the silhouette step out. He moved with that very specific, unhurried certainty of a man who has already decided exactly how a situation is going to play out. I knew that walk. I had watched him cross 100 rooms with it. Grace's hand clamped around my wrist. Not gently, urgently. "Come with me," she said. "Right now." It wasn't a question, and she didn't wait for me to formulate one. I stood up. I looked back exactly once toward the double doors leading to the surgical wing where Silas Thorne had been taken 40 minutes earlier, sedated, bleeding, completely oblivious to what was unfolding out here. I thought about the one word he had spoken in my back seat. Just his name, like a fact he needed me to have. Then I looked away from the doors and followed Grace down the hall. The supply closet at the end of the corridor smelled like rubbing alcohol and cardboard. It was roughly the size of a generous walk-in pantry. Grace shoved me inside without ceremony. "You stay in here. The door stays closed. Do not come out." I did exactly what she said. Because there are certain people in your life who, when the sky is falling, don't ask if you're sure and don't ask why. They just ask what needs to happen next. Grace had been that person for 22 years. Standing in the dark between a rack of gauze rolls and a broken IV stand, I realized I had never fully appreciated what that meant until tonight. I thought about the first time I ever saw Grant. It was 3 years ago at a private art auction on the Upper East Side. It was one of those nights where the guest list is smaller than the insured value of the room. A 17th century Flemish oil painting was the centerpiece of the sale, a merchant scene with that deep amber glow that only genuine antiquity can produce. I had been studying it for 10 minutes when I noticed the man standing 2 feet to my left. He was looking at the exact same painting, but not the way I was looking at it. I was reading it. The brushstrokes, the croquelure, the way the varnish had yellowed unevenly in the bottom left corner, in a pattern consistent with its era. He was calculating it. There was no other word for that expression. He was looking at something beautiful, and all he saw was what it was worth to own it. Back then, I mistook that look for sophistication. Now, standing in a dark hospital supply closet, I understood that what I had seen was instinct. The instinct of a predator identifying value and acquiring it. And I had been the acquisition, right from that very first night. Through the tiny crack where the closet door hadn't fully shut, I watched Grant walk into the ER. He was wearing a dark suit. Not the one he had worn at dinner, which meant he had gone home, changed, and taken the time to compose himself before coming here. His hair was flawless. His expression was carefully arranged into something that from a distance read as controlled concern. It was a practiced face. He approached the nurse's station and said something to the clerk. Less than 2 minutes later, Grace emerged from a side hallway. I couldn't hear the exchange, The distance and the ambient noise of the ER swallowed everything, but I watched it the way I had been trained to look at antiques, searching for the details the surface was designed to hide. Grant placed a white envelope on the counter between them. He slid it forward with 2 fingers. He didn't hand it over. He slid it. The subtle gesture of a man who has done this 100 times before and knows exactly how to make a bribe look like absolutely nothing. Grace looked at the envelope. She looked up at Grant. She nodded. Grant smiled. It was that specific smile of his, the one that stopped right at the line where his eyes began. Then he followed a staff member toward the patient rooms. Grace came back to me 4 minutes later. She opened the closet door, slipped inside, and shut it behind her. She held a syringe in her open palm. Still capped, still sealed. "He wants me to administer a sedative," she whispered. "High dose." I told him I'd take care of it. She stared at the syringe for a second, then set it down on the shelf next to the gauze. "I'm going to document this as an AMA, with a witness," she said, speaking quickly and precisely the way she explained medical procedures. No sugarcoating, no preamble. Under New York state law, a patient has the right to leave a medical facility at any time against the advice of their healthcare team. The process is called Against Medical Advice, or AMA. The attending charge nurse can document it and act as the witness. It requires no judge, no specialist's signature. Grace was the charge nurse on duty. She would put in the system that Caroline Sterling had been present, had been fully informed of the medical risks of leaving at 8 months pregnant, and had chosen to walk out anyway. Signed, witnessed, filed. Completely legal, completely ordinary. Silas was more complicated, but not impossible. Robert Hall had already faxed a medical power of attorney to the hospital's administrative line. Hall later told me that Silas kept a permanent standing POA updated every single quarter. It could be transmitted to any receiving medical facility with a single encrypted command. That command had been sent from Silas's secondary burner phone in the same 7-minute window before he passed out in my car. The same window he used to text Hall, my new number. He had prepared for this fallout before I even knew there was fallout to prepare for. The document, which my father's lawyer had apparently kept on standby for situations I was only just beginning to comprehend, authorized the transfer of Silas Thorne's medical care to an alternate facility under the direction of his designated proxy. Grace was going to log it as a standard interfacility transfer initiated by the patient's legal representative. The receiving facility was a private clinic out of the city, discreet, strictly off the books, with absolutely zero ties to Grant's network. "And Grant," I asked, "when he doesn't find me in a room, he's going to find my car outside." "He'll find your license plates," Grace corrected. "The police report will show a vehicle registered to Caroline Sterling wrecked on the highway with the driver missing." She paused. "I'm not going to tell him anything. I'm not filing a false report. He's going to draw his own conclusions based on the pieces he already has." She picked the sealed syringe up off the shelf and shoved it deep into her scrub pocket. "That's going to be his mistake, not mine." I understood exactly what she meant. Grant's entire model of control relied on knowing exactly where I was. If his tracking signal went dark, he would fill the silence with whatever explanation suited his guilt. An 8.5 months pregnant woman, a wrecked car, no body, no hospital admission record. His mind would go exactly where his guilt pointed. Grace hadn't given him a fake story. She simply stopped giving him anything at all. 40 minutes later, Silas was on a gurney heading out the hospital's service exit. He was unconscious. The surgery to repair his shoulder had gone off without complications, Grace told me, but the anesthesia was going to keep him under for hours. Thick, white gauze bandages wrapped entirely around his right shoulder and chest. Under the harsh light of the loading dock, I finally got a clear look at his face. Strong jaw, faint, jagged scar near his left temple. He had that specific kind of stillness of a man who, even while heavily sedated, never looks entirely defenseless. He was a complete stranger. I knew absolutely nothing about him beyond his first name, and the fact that he had weaponized a motorcycle against a semi-truck to keep me from getting killed. And yet, according to Robert Hall, this man had spent 8 months silently standing guard over my life. The gurney wheels clattered over the door threshold and the service exit opened into the freezing dark night. A private ambulance was already idling in position. A contact of mine, Grace whispered. A licensed transport service that didn't ask unnecessary questions in exchange for the kind of under-the-table referrals that kept a small business afloat. I climbed in the back next to the gurney. The doors slammed shut. The transport team 2 medics Grace trusted told me Silas was stabilized enough for a short-distance transfer. Not recovering. Stabilized. There's a major difference, and I was starting to understand it. Through the small rear window as the ambulance pulled away, I watched the hospital shrink into the distance. On the 3rd floor, a row of windows was still lit up. Grant was up there somewhere, pacing a floor where neither of us existed anymore, searching for a ghost he was never going to find. I didn't know what conclusion he would arrive at by sunrise. I only knew that whatever he decided to believe, the distance between that belief and the truth was the only thing standing between me and whatever came next. The ambulance turned onto the service road, and the hospital lights vanished behind a cluster of bare, skeletal trees. I rested my hand on my stomach. The baby shifted slow and deliberate against my ribs like a reminder. We were both still here. For tonight, that had to be enough. The thing I had always loved most about Grace's apartment was the living room window. It faced west, which meant the morning light hit it at a sharp angle, turning the whole room golden for about 40 minutes before the high-rise across the street blocked it out. I had sat in that morning light more times than I could count over the years. Hungover once in college, heartbroken twice in my 20s, and once just so exhausted that Grace had simply handed me a blanket and told me I could stay on her couch until I felt human again. That window had always meant something simple to me, something safe. When I pulled the curtain back that morning, safety was not what I found. 3 black SUVs were parked along the curb across the street in a loose formation, engines idling, windows completely tinted. They weren't staggered the way cars naturally parallel park. They were positioned, deliberate spacing, clear lines of sight directly to the front entrance of the building. They had been there since before I woke up. Grace told me as soon as I said her name. Since before 5:00 a.m. She walked out of the kitchen and set a mug of tea on the windowsill next to me, not making a big deal out of it. Hot 2 sugars. She had been making it that exact way since we were teenagers. I never even had to ask. I wrapped both hands around the mug and focused on the heat spreading into my palms because it was the only thing in the room that felt entirely real. "They're not cops," I said. "No," Grace agreed. "Cops don't sit still like that." They weren't press either. No visible camera gear, no one stepping out to stretch their legs. Just 3 massive dark shapes breathing exhaust, fumes into the freezing morning air, keeping watch over a building where apparently 2 of them suspected someone might still be alive. The burner phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I crossed the room and picked it up before the second vibration. Robert Hall's voice was exactly the same as it had been at 2:00 a.m. Measured precise, giving nothing away for free. "Do not open the front door. Stay away from the street-facing windows. I have someone coming for you." "Who?" I asked. "The same person who intercepted the truck last night. He's already on his way." I looked across the kitchen at Grace. She looked back at me with the expression she reserved for trauma shifts, the one where she had decided to hold her ground regardless of how terrified she actually felt. "We'll wait." 12 minutes later, there were 3 sharp knocks on the back service door. A brief pause. Then 2 more. Grace walked over, checked the peephole, undid the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. Silas Thorne stepped inside from the service corridor. It had been barely 8 hours since he got off the operating table. Enough time, apparently, for the doctor at the private clinic to decide that a man with Silas's unique pain tolerance and his very specific reasons for needing to move could be discharged AMA, with strict aftercare instructions that he was clearly going to selectively ignore. He was still wearing the clothes they had put on him post-op. Dark, tactical pants. A grey shirt with the right side completely cut open to accommodate the massive, thick white bandages wrapping his shoulder and chest. He moved carefully. One hand grazed the doorframe as he crossed the threshold. I could see the tight clench of his jaw showing exactly what every step cost him. But his eyes were something else entirely. Sharp, calm, absorbing every single detail of the room in the first 2 seconds he was inside. It was the way a professional looks at a space when they are evaluating threats, not just seeing furniture. He walked straight to the window and peered through a tiny slit in the curtain down at the 3 SUVs. He stood there in total silence for a long moment. Then he spoke. "He knows you're alive, Caroline. He's been watching this building since 4 in the morning and he didn't come up here to ask questions. He's waiting to make sure the answer he wants is the only one left." I watched him say it the way I'd watch someone handle an antique I was trying to date, looking for the inconsistencies, the place where the surface didn't match the foundation. I didn't find any. He stated it like a verified fact, not a guess. "Who are you?" I asked. "And why did my father put my life in your hands?" He turned away from the window and looked directly at me. It was the first time we were in the same room, both fully conscious. It felt deeply disorienting. This face that I had only seen in the dim glow of a rainy highway and the harsh glare of a hospital corridor was now standing in my best friend's kitchen, bathed in ordinary morning light. He didn't flinch at the question, but he didn't answer it immediately either. "I will explain everything to you," he said. "But not here, and not while those vehicles are idling downstairs. Is there anything you need to take with you? Where are we going?" "Somewhere they can't track a signal." I stood in the kitchen of my oldest friend's apartment, 8.5 months pregnant, my tea going cold in my hands. I stared at this stranger, this man who had driven head-on into a semi-truck just to keep me breathing, who was now standing in front of me with bloody bandages, showing through a shredded shirt, asking me to follow him to an undisclosed location. Every rational instinct I had screamed that this was exactly the kind of situation my father had warned me about. Never move without information. Never trust without proof. Never let urgency substitute for clarity. But apparently my father had trusted this man with my life before I even had the chance to form an opinion. I set the mug down on the counter. I took one last look through the curtain at the 3 black SUVs waiting on the street below, patient, deliberate predators waiting for confirmation that wasn't going to come as long as I kept moving. I looked back at Silas. "Then you better start talking while we drive," I said. He nodded once. Not like a man who had won an argument, but like a man who expected exactly that answer. He reached past Grace to grab the small duffel bag she had already packed for me, which told me Grace had made her decision several minutes before I made mine. I followed him out the back service door. I didn't know what he was going to tell me yet. I didn't know what my father had seen in this man to deem him worthy of 40 months of silent surveillance and a deliberate motorcycle crash. But I knew that whatever this story was, it had started long before the night I ran out of my own house. And I was already living right in the middle of it. The sedan Silas was driving was the kind of car designed to vanish in traffic. Grey, mid-sized. Nothing that would hold anyone's attention for longer than it took to register it and look away. It had Connecticut plates. I noticed that without asking, the same way I had noticed his specific knock pattern on Grace's door, and the way he checked the rearview mirror 3 times in the first 2 blocks without making it obvious. None of it was accidental. Every detail about this man was calculated. I sat in the passenger seat, my small bag on my lap, watching Manhattan slip by through the window in the faint early light. The city had that specific energy it only gets between 5:00 and 7:00 a.m. Not asleep but not quite awake yet. Running on a skeleton crew of street sweepers, night shift nurses and dog walkers huddled in heavy coats against the cold. I had lived in New York for 11 years, and I had never felt more like a stranger to it than I did in that exact moment. I looked down at my left hand. My wedding ring was gone. I had taken it off and left it on the windowsill in Grace's apartment before we walked out. It was a decision I had made without overthinking it. How do you make the choices that end up mattering the most? The skin where the ring had sat for 3 years was slightly paler, a faint indentation in the shape of something that didn't exist anymore. I closed my hand into a loose fist and turned to Silas. "Tell me about my father," I said. "All of it." He drove for a moment without replying. It wasn't evasion. It was the pause of someone deciding where the story actually begins. 10 years ago, he started. I was a federal agent assigned to a financial crimes task force. Edward Sterling had been targeted by a highly sophisticated organized crime syndicate. They were using a web of shell companies to launder money through legitimate fine art acquisitions. Sterling Fine Arts was one of 3 firms they had flagged as useful infrastructure. The operation had required deep, embedded protection, someone close enough to be effective. For 6 months, Silas had lived entirely inside my father's world, eating at the same dinner tables, riding in the same cars, standing in the very rooms where the real conversations happened and the real decisions were made. He was the most careful man I've ever worked with, Silas said. Careful in the way only someone who builds an empire from the ground up can be, because he knew exactly how much he had to lose. Silas paused, and there was a heavy, costly honesty in his voice. The case closed. The syndicate was prosecuted. I moved on to other assignments. I thought that was the end of it. But 5 years later, Edward Sterling called him. He didn't call to report a crime, and he didn't call to cash in a favor. He called to ask for something entirely off the books. The specific kind of help that exists in the gray area between what federal institutions can legally do and what a desperate man who completely trusts you needs done. Edward's health had been rapidly deteriorating for 8 months, much faster than any of his world-class doctors could medically explain. He had no hard proof, but he had spent 4 decades reading people and spotting anomalies in an industry where getting either wrong could cost you everything, and his gut told him that what was happening to his body was not natural. Grant had been his son-in-law for 2 years by then. Edward had been observing him silently, over time, looking for the exact place where Grant's surface polish didn't match the foundation underneath. He found it. He couldn't go to the authorities, Silas said, keeping his eyes on the road. Not without hard evidence, and he knew that if he confronted Grant directly, Grant would just accelerate whatever timeline he was already operating on. So he did what careful men do when they know they are running out of time. Silas glanced at me briefly, then looked back at the highway. He built something that Grant couldn't dismantle. The structure Edward created was an irrevocable trust established under Delaware law. Delaware has some of the most sophisticated, airtight, and protective trust statutes in the entire country. Under a Delaware irrevocable trust, once the ink is dry and the assets are transferred, the person who created it cannot take it back. They cannot alter the terms, and they cannot be legally strong-armed into dissolving it. It becomes its own breathing legal entity, governed entirely by the rules Edward wrote and executed by the trustee he appointed. That trustee was Silas. The trust quietly held 40% of the voting shares of Sterling Fine Arts. On the SEC filings and shareholder reports, the ownership simply read as the Edward Sterling Family Trust, a completely legitimate designation that gave absolutely zero clue as to who was actually pulling the strings on those shares. Grant knew the trust existed. He had seen it in the estate paperwork after my father passed, but the identity of the trustee was shielded by brutal confidentiality clauses Edward had hardwired into the agreement. Without knowing who held the trigger, Grant had no target to pressure, no obstacle to remove. But more importantly, that 40% voting block came with a highly specific poison pill. Its full voting rights could only be formally activated by Caroline Sterling herself, or her legally authorized proxy, which meant that every single major financial decision Grant had made as acting director of Sterling Fine Arts for the last 3 years had been executed without a valid shareholder quorum. Every corporate acquisition, every restructuring, every massive contract that required board approval, all of it was technically null and void. All of it was a house of cards, just waiting for the wind to blow. I sat with that for a long time. The car crossed an intersection. Outside the window, the sky over the East River was beginning to break. The flat gray of the early morning was giving way to something warmer near the horizon, the first hint of color before the real light hits. He knew, I finally said. It wasn't really a question. He knew Grant was going to do this. Silas stayed quiet for a second. It wasn't a long silence, barely a breath, but I had spent 11 years learning how to read the difference between a restored antique and an original. I knew how to read the gaps, and that tiny pause told me everything his words hadn't reached yet. "Yes," Silas said quietly. He knew. I turned my face toward the cold glass of the window. My father had sat across from Grant at dinner tables. He had sat across from him in board meetings. He had sat across from him during all those quiet, private moments where families pantomime closeness, and he had known. He hadn't told me because he understood that if I knew the truth I would confront Grant directly, and a direct confrontation with a sociopath who was already plotting 3 moves ahead would only end one way. So, instead, my father built an invisible fortress around me, one I couldn't see and therefore couldn't accidentally tear down. He had trusted Silas with my life, because he trusted me too much to put that devastating weight on my shoulders before I was ready to carry it. Just then the baby moved, a slow, deliberate roll against my ribs. The first real movement I had felt since the chaos of the night before. I pressed my palm flat against my side and felt the firm, insistent push in response. We're still here times, I thought. Both of us. I had more questions. Silas's slight hesitation before answering me told me there was still a piece of the puzzle missing, a shadow in the story that hadn't found the light yet. I could feel its shape the way I could feel a structural gap beneath a damaged layer of lacquer, not by looking at it directly, but by observing how the surface behaved around the edges. But I didn't ask. Not yet. The sky was getting brighter, and the tires kept humming on the highway. I had learned a long time ago that some truths are better approached only when you are truly ready to survive the answer. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the car was the smell. It wasn't exhaust fumes, and it wasn't hospital antiseptic. It wasn't that distinct blend of hot concrete and expensive cologne that Manhattan breathes out at all hours. It was just salt and freezing air, and somewhere behind the low-slung houses at the end of the road, the rhythmic, heavy sound of the ocean crashing against rock. Patient, slow, completely indifferent to everything that had happened to me over the last 72 hours. I stood on the gravel driveway and just breathed. Really breathed. The kind of deep inhale you completely forget how to do when your body has been running on pure adrenaline for 3 days straight. My lungs expanded to the very bottom for the first time since I stood in that hallway outside Grant's study. I heard my name called through a screen door that wasn't fully shut. My father used to talk about a place like this. Retirement, he'd say, with that specific kind of wistful nostalgia of a man who secretly knows he's never actually going to stop working. Somewhere small, near the water, somewhere that doesn't require a calendar to function. He used to mention it at dinner parties and during long drives. I suddenly remembered him standing in front of a 19th century Dutch seascape at a private gallery, showing his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the painted water the way most exhausted people stare at a real ocean. He never made it here. 40 years of building an empire that ended up being worth fighting for had stolen that from him. And now, here I was, standing in a coastal town so small it didn't even have a stoplight, arriving not for retirement but for something that didn't have a clean, socially acceptable name. But I was doing it in his honor in a way neither of us would have ever chosen. The house Silas had arranged was at the dead end of a short road running parallel to the rocky coastline. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window over the sink facing east, a front porch that would probably be beautiful if the weather ever warmed up. The landlord was a guy in his 70s who met us in the driveway. He already had the keys in his hand and carried the distinct attitude of a man who had decided decades ago that other people's business was none of his. He took the thick envelope of cash Silas handed him, dropped the keys into Silas's palm, and muttered that the radiator banged a bit on cold nights. That was the entire transaction. 3 days after we arrived, Silas sat me down at the small kitchen table. He placed 2 thick manila folders in front of me, Caroline Carter and Daniel Thorne, a couple recently relocated from Boston. She was on extended maternity leave from an architectural design firm. He was a freelance consultant. Clean credit histories, no red flags, no digital anomalies. It was the exact kind of flawless, boring paper trail that invites absolutely zero questions, because there is nothing remotely interesting enough to investigate. I've been building these for weeks, Silas told me, since before that night, which meant my father had asked him to prepare for a nightmare scenario long before I had any idea the nightmare was coming. I stared at the name on the forged driver's license. Caroline Carter. I whispered it out loud once just to feel how strange it sounded in my own mouth. Then I shoved the folders into the bottom drawer beneath the kitchen counter and tried not to think about them unless I absolutely had to. I started taking on small restoration jobs by the second week. I got the commissions through an anonymous profile on a highly specialized restorers forum. Silas had routed all the payments through a holding account tied to a shell LLC that traced back to a dead end. Tiny pieces at first. A water-damaged gilded frame. A pair of 19th century botanical prints with brutal foxing around the edges. It was the kind of grueling microscopic work that demands absolute patience, a steady hand, and total concentration, which was exactly what I needed, because total concentration left no empty space in my brain for the panic to creep in. Maine in April is not a gentle place. The wind blowing off the Atlantic was sharp enough to cut through every sweater I owned. The daylight was pale and flat for most of the afternoon, but the town possessed that specific sturdy quiet of places where the locals have learned not to expect much from the outside world. We were newcomers, and they treated us with a soft, undemanding politeness that coastal communities reserve for people who don't cause trouble and don't seem like they're packing up anytime soon. No one asked where we came from. No one asked why we were hiding. I slowly realized it was the first time in my entire adult life that no one knew who I was, and the anonymity began to feel less like a prison and more like room to breathe. My contractions hit at 2:00 a.m., exactly 3 weeks after we moved in. I had been through enough Braxton Hicks false alarms by then to know instantly that this was the real thing. I got out of bed, walked to the kitchen, gripped the edge of the cold counter with both hands, and breathed through the first massive wave of pain. Then I called Grace. She answered on the first ring. What followed were 14 hours that I am not going to pretend were beautiful, peaceful, or anything other than exactly what they were agonizing. Grace had pulled an emergency personal leave from Manhattan General 3 days prior. She didn't tell her supervisor why, only that it was a family emergency, which wasn't entirely a lie. Grace's face was glowing on the laptop screen stationed at the foot of the bed. Her voice was steady, clinical, and fiercely professional, though occasionally trembling around the edges in a way she probably didn't think I noticed. Silas stayed by my side the entire time. He didn't offer empty platitudes because we both knew useless comfort was insulting. He was just there, a rock-solid presence, handing me ice, letting me crush the bones in his hand when the pain peaked. He was the anchor the room desperately needed, and I didn't realize until that exact moment how heavily I was leaning on him. "You're doing great," Grace said through the speakers for the 5th time. "You are a terrible liar," I gritted out. "I know," she replied. "Keep pushing." So, I pushed. Leo arrived just before 4:00 a.m. He was born into a bedroom that smelled of wood smoke and the freezing ocean, while the coastal wind hammered against the window panes, and the old radiator clanged loudly, exactly like the landlord had warned us it would. He was tiny, absolutely furious, and entirely himself from the very first second he drew breath. He had that overwhelming raw vitality that newborns carry before the world has had a chance to wear them down. When he finally cried, the sound drowned out the storm outside. At some point I looked up. I don't remember exactly when, but Silas was staring down at Leo with an expression I didn't have a word for. It wasn't shock. It wasn't that performative theatrical awe that people plaster on their faces in hospital delivery rooms. It was something much quieter and much more permanent. The look of a man watching something shift from a concept into an absolute truth. Grace said something through the laptop. I mumbled a reply. Eventually, the screen went black and the room settled into a heavy, exhausted silence. Later, maybe an hour, maybe 2, I had completely lost the thread of time. I woke up from a half-sleep to find the left side of the bed empty. I turned my head toward the window. Silas was standing with his back to me, holding Leo tight against his chest, staring out at the pitch-black ocean. The sky outside was still dark, but at the very edge of the horizon there was the faintest smudge of grey, the first sign that morning was coming. He stood completely still with my tiny, fragile son pressed against him. One of his massive hands was cupped securely around the back of Leo's head, holding him with a fierce gentleness that wasn't practiced at all. I watched them for a long time without moving. Something shifted deep in my chest. It wasn't a dramatic explosion of feeling like they write about in novels. It was just a small, quiet settling, like a heavy wooden door finally clicking shut when the pressure in a room equalizes. I was too tired to put a name to what it was. I closed my eyes, listened to the rhythmic crash of the waves, and let the sound pull me back under. 3 years is not a long time if you are living the life you carefully planned out. But if you are building a life from the ashes up, if every single morning requires a deliberate, conscious act of deciding that this times is reality now, that the fake name on the mailbox belongs to you, that the toddler babbling in the next room is the reason you keep moving forward, and not the weight pulling you under, then 3 years isn't just a stretch of time. It is an entire universe. And like any universe, it is built almost entirely out of tiny, insignificant things. During those first disorienting weeks in Maine, Silas had given me one piece of advice. Don't think about New York. Just think about tomorrow morning. At the time, I thought it was a stupid, patronizing cliché to feed a woman who had just lost her marriage, her home, her real name, and her entire understanding of her own reality in the span of 24 hours. I thought he was throwing me a generic lifeline because he had nothing actually useful to say. It took me 3 years to realize it wasn't a platitude. It was the exact psychological mechanism he had used to survive his own dark years, working deep undercover in violent places where clean exits didn't exist. One morning, then the next. Not because the big picture doesn't matter, but because the big picture will crush you flat if you try to carry all of it at once. So I learned to think about mornings. Mornings in Maine were very specific. They stayed brutally cold much longer into the spring than seemed fair. The light always came in low and sideways off the Atlantic, and the kitchen always smelled like sea salt mixed with whatever Silas had started cooking before I even came downstairs. Without ever making a grand announcement, Silas had taken over the cooking. He was remarkably good at it, a fact I discovered slowly and pretended not to find incredibly disarming. He made his coffee dark and bitter, his eggs simple, and he always cooked enough for 3, even before Leo was old enough to eat solid food, like he was already practicing for the version of us that was coming. Leo became himself the way all children do faster than you think is biologically possible, and then suddenly he was exactly the person he was always meant to be. By the time he was 2, he had very aggressive opinions about everything. Which sippy cup was acceptable, which bedtime story was mandatory, which side of the kitchen table he had to sit on. He inherited Silas's eerie, focused stillness when he was concentrating on a task, but possessed a wild, kinetic energy that was entirely his own. He demanded to be noticed, filling every corner of whatever room he was in to the absolute brim. He started calling Silas Dad Silas right around his 2nd birthday. There was no sit-down conversation, no awkward transition period. It just appeared out of his mouth one morning, the way certain monumental words drop into a toddler's vocabulary, already carrying massive weight. No one had coached him. No one had prompted him. The first time Silas heard it, he froze. He stared at the little boy for a split second, with that exact same look I had seen in the dark the night Leo was born. The raw, unprotected look. He never corrected Leo. Not once in all the years that followed. On weekday afternoons, when the light was still decent and the coastal wind had died down to something tolerable, Silas would take Leo out to the front porch. He had a small wooden crate filled with scrap pine blocks and squares of sandpaper in different grits. He started this routine when Leo was barely old enough to grip a block with both hands. It was some deep, patient instinct in Silas recognizing that this hyperactive kid needed a physical task to quiet his racing mind. They would sit side by side on the wooden steps. Leo, with his tongue poking slightly out the corner of his mouth in deep concentration, running the sandpaper over the wood in slow, deliberate strokes, exactly the way Silas had shown him. The sound of it, that soft, rhythmic times of grit biting into pine, would drift through the open kitchen window while I worked on my restorations. I would put down my tools and just watch them. Leo was learning patience. Not because some adult was barking at him to sit still, but because the massive man sitting next to him was the physical embodiment of patience. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that just quietly does the work until the job is done. I had seen that exact quality in Silas on a blood-soaked highway when he managed to stand up with a shredded shoulder. Now, I was seeing it translate into fatherhood. Silas's right shoulder still gave him hell when the temperature dropped below freezing. He never complained about it, but I had learned to read the subtle changes in his posture on cold mornings. A tight stiffness across his trapezius muscle, and sometimes when he thought my back was turned, his left hand would reach up and press hard against the thick scar tissue hidden beneath his flannel shirt before dropping back to whatever he was doing. I never brought it up. He never let it slow him down. I didn't ask because acknowledging it would have made him self-conscious, and making Silas Thorne feel self-conscious felt like a crime. The November after Leo turned 2, he spiked a brutal fever. By midnight, it hit 104 degrees. He was crying in that sustained, exhausting, breathless way that toddlers cry when they don't have the vocabulary to explain how much their body hurts, and they feel betrayed that the adults haven't fixed it yet. Silas sat on the edge of Leo's mattress for 6 hours straight. He murmured stories in a low, gravelly voice already hoarse from lack of sleep, and every 15 minutes, with absolute mechanical precision, he swapped out the damp washcloth on Leo's forehead for a fresh, cold one. He brought the same methodical, relentless reliability to a sick toddler that he brought to everything else in his life. I sat in the doorway. I didn't go in, because in that specific moment I wasn't entirely sure the room needed me. Around 4:00 a.m., Leo finally stopped thrashing. His breathing leveled out, his tiny, clenched fists uncurled, and the bedroom settled into the heavy, exhausted silence of a broken fever. Silas stayed sitting on the edge of the bed. I stayed sitting in the doorway. We didn't exchange a single word. There are certain things in life that don't need to be defined out loud, because they define themselves over time. By accumulation, by showing up. I finally understood that, sitting in the dark frame of my son's bedroom door, on the afternoon of Leo's 3rd birthday, he came sprinting in from the porch, launching his entire body at Silas's knees, with the reckless commitment of a kid who has absolutely zero concept of personal boundaries. He looked up at Silas with massive, serious eyes. "Dad, Silas," he demanded, "are you always going to stay here?" Silas froze. He went completely still. He looked down at Leo for a long time. It wasn't the hesitation of a man searching for the easiest lie. It was the pause of a man making a blood oath, ensuring he truly meant what he was about to say. "Always, buddy," Silas said. Leo accepted this massive promise with the casual, immediate satisfaction of someone who had never actually doubted it but just wanted it on the record. He let go of Silas's knees and ran right back out to the porch. I was standing in the kitchen doorway. I had heard every word. I stayed completely frozen until I was sure my face was under control. Then I walked back to my workbench, where a cracked 19th century oil painting was waiting for me. It needed weeks of microscopic, careful filling before it would be stable enough for the next layer of paint. Patient work, slow work. The kind of work that demands you trust the process even when you can't see the finished product yet. That night after Leo was asleep, I sat alone on the front porch with a wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, listening to the crashing waves. The town was pitch black and silent. The sky above me held more stars than I had ever seen growing up in Manhattan. The fact that I was no longer surprised by the stars meant I was more at home on this freezing coastline than I had ever consciously decided to be. The peace of this life was real. But hiding just beneath the floorboards of that peace, humming like a low-voltage wire, was the truth I had refused to look directly at. The life I had run away from was still out there. Grant was still out there. The trust fund, the financial evidence, the agonizing years my father had spent building a legal trap that I hadn't yet found the courage to spring. None of that vanished just because I had found a quiet place to hide. I had spent 3 years strictly thinking about Times tomorrow morning, sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket with the Atlantic Ocean roaring in the dark, and my healthy son asleep inside. I realized that tomorrow morning had finally arrived. That morning started the exact same way every morning in Maine had started for 3 years. Coffee first, because absolutely nothing was negotiated before the coffee. Then came the sound of Leo's voice drifting in from the backyard. He had developed a routine of spending his first 20 minutes post-breakfast conducting some highly classified investigation of the dirt near the back fence, which I had learned never to interrupt. The pale, watery light of early March spilled through the kitchen window. I had a 19th century pocket watch completely disassembled on my workbench. 7 microscopic components of the mainspring and a balance wheel the size of a shirt button were laid out on a square of black velvet, perfectly arranged in the order I had extracted them. I was hunched over with a jeweler's loop pressed to my eye, inspecting a pivot hole for friction wear, when my phone screen lit up next to my elbow. It was a push notification from an anonymous fine art news aggregator I still monitored, one of those insider platforms that tracks high-end private sales and auction provenance. I almost ignored it. I was in the middle of a delicate inspection and the pivot hole wasn't going to log itself, but I tapped the screen. The headline was exactly 14 words long. I read it once, then I read it again slowly. The way you reread a sentence when your brain violently rejects the information it just processed. Grant Vaughan to unveil Sterling Heirloom at April Charity Gala. First public showing of iconic Sterling Dawn. Right below the headline was a high-resolution photograph. The vase was displayed on an illuminated pedestal shot from a glamorous 3/4 angle. The celadon glaze caught the studio lighting, perfectly radiating that deep internal glow that only antique porcelain possesses. The article described it as a priceless family treasure, a 19th century Chinese export piece with an unbroken chain of custody through 4 generations of the Sterling family. It was being offered up for the very first time as the centerpiece of a massive charity auction for the Vaughan Foundation. The second paragraph noted almost as an afterthought that Caroline Sterling, the last documented heir and custodian of the vase, had been missing and presumed dead for 3 years following an unsolved highway accident. Grant Vaughan was listed as the acting trustee of the Sterling estate. I set the phone down. I picked it up again. I zoomed in on the photograph and stared at it for a long, long time. My father had purchased the real Sterling Dawn when I was 12. It was a quiet, private acquisition from an estate sale in Connecticut. The piece had been severely neglected and it sat in a locked cabinet in his office for 8 years before he finally decided I was skilled enough to restore it properly. He handed it to me as my first masterclass project when I was 23. I spent 6 agonizing months working on that vase. I learned more from that single piece of porcelain than I did from any university course. I learned how high-fired celadon glaze behaves. I learned the chemical difference between a thermal stress fracture and an impact fracture, and how each requires a completely different microscopic filling technique. And right at the very base of the vase, in a spot that would be completely invisible when mounted on a display stand, I had executed a tiny stabilizing repair on a hairline stress crack using a custom-tinted polymer consolidant. I had mixed the pigment myself. I got it close, but I didn't get it perfect. There was a microscopic hint of warmth in the gray binder that stood out just slightly from the original cold glaze. Unless you knew exactly where to put the magnifying glass, you would never see it. I only documented that specific repair in my private encrypted restoration logs. It was never added to the official provenance file. No appraiser working off secondary photographs would ever know it existed. The vase in the news article photograph did not have that repair. The glaze on the base was flawlessly smooth and uniformly cold, exactly the color the original would have been before I ever laid hands on it, which meant whoever forged this piece had built it using the official outdated provenance photos. They were good. terrifyingly good. The structural proportions were mathematically perfect. The firing quality was elite. The artificial surface aging was sophisticated enough to fool 90% of the collectors in that auction room. But the forger didn't have the original vase to copy. I did. I stood up from the table and walked down the short hallway to the tiny spare room I used as a supply closet. On the top shelf, sitting above my jars of solvents and varnishes, was a heavy wooden lockbox. Unassuming, dusty. The kind of box that actively discourages curiosity. I had grabbed it from the glass display case in the Sterling Mansion hallway on the exact night I ran for my life. It was a blind, panic-driven instinct, one of several I had operated on that night. I hadn't opened it in 3 years. I had just carried it from Grace's apartment to Silas's car to this shelf in Maine, treating it like a loaded gun I wasn't ready to fire. I popped the latch. The vase was wrapped in thick archival conservation tissue, exactly the way I had packed it 3 years ago. I lifted it out carefully, rolling the heavy porcelain in my hands, and flipped it upside down to check the base. The repair was right there, that tiny, stubborn hint of warmth in the grey. The almost, but not quite, perfect colour I had mixed in a cramped studio apartment on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 23, learning what true patience actually cost. I held it in the quiet room for a minute. Then I carried it into the kitchen. Silas was leaning against the counter when I walked in. He had heard Leo come inside and was already pouring a second round of coffee to prepare for the inevitable toddler tornado. I placed my phone flat on the table in front of him. I didn't say a word. I just waited while he read the article. He stayed perfectly still for several seconds after he finished reading. Then, he looked up at me. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I had been standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the ocean while he read, asking myself the exact same question. 3 years ago, I ran because staying in New York would have put me in the ground. I had built a real breathing life in this freezing coastal town. The little boy drawing with crayons in the next room, the quiet mornings, the smell of sawdust, the 2 mugs of coffee. None of that vanished just because Grant Vaughn bought a fake vase. But my father had spent the final agonizing months of his life building a legal fortress to protect me. He had gathered the evidence. He had mapped the exit routes. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy the man who murdered him. And the trigger to that weapon was currently sitting on my kitchen table. I thought about what my father had told me about antique restoration. He said the point wasn't to make things look brand new. The point was to understand times, why times they were built to last in the first place, and honor that foundation. I always thought he was talking about porcelain. Standing in that kitchen in March of 2024, I realized he was talking about us. The Sterling family. I turned away from the window and looked Silas in the eye. "I think it's time to go home," I said. He studied my face for a long moment. Then he looked at the wooden box, then back at me. "Then we plan it tight," he said, his voice dropping into that hyper-focused operational tone. "No mistakes." I nodded. Outside, Leo started yelling, demanding to know if sandpaper worked on seashells. Silas yelled back that they would find out after lunch. The morning kept moving forward in all its loud, ordinary, beautiful ways. The coffee machine hissed. The light shifted across the water. My son's voice bounced off the walls of a house that had against all odds become a real home. But the air in the room had fundamentally changed. After 3 years of holding my breath, I could finally feel the tension snapping. The trap was set. Before I tell you exactly what Silas uncovered about my father, the secret that broke me and rebuilt me at the exact same time, I need to know you're still with me. Type "I knew it" in the comments if you've had a bad feeling about Grant from the very beginning. Just a heads up, the next part of this story contains some intense fictional elements designed for dramatic storytelling. Some of this gets dark. If you need to pause and step away for a second, this is a good place to do it. I used to think revenge was an event, a dramatic movie scene where you kick open a door, scream at the person who hurt you, and walk away in slow motion. I don't think that anymore. Now I understand that justice, real permanent justice, is architecture. It requires a foundation of irrefutable evidence. It requires patience, and it requires putting the exact right people in the exact right rooms when the final load-bearing wall is kicked out. Revenge is emotional. Justice is a math equation. And for the first time in 3 years, I had all the numbers. Silas and I spent 2 full days sitting at the kitchen table. He watched me spread blank sheets of paper across the wood, mapping out the operation. It was a habit from my restoration work, charting the total scope of the damage before you ever make the first cut. He didn't interrupt. He just watched me work for a long time, and then muttered quietly that I ran a planning session exactly the way my father used to run a boardroom. I took it as the highest compliment I could ever receive, and I kept writing. The operation had 2 separate, independently moving parts. They were designed to operate in total isolation, but detonate at the exact same second. Phase 1 was the vase, the real Sterling Dawn, the one with my sloppy 2-3-year-old epoxy repair hidden on the base, was going to be shipped directly to Sotheby's Manhattan. We used a bonded high-end art logistics firm with bulletproof insurance documentation. It would arrive at the auction house logged as a competing lot, submitted by an anonymous, highly credentialed restoration expert. It would be accompanied by a sworn certificate of authentication detailing the exact microscopic technical markers that proved Grant's vase was a forgery. The certificate was written in the dry, clinical language of an expert legal witness, because that is exactly what it was about to become. The moment Sotheby's intake appraisers placed both vases side by side under a macro lens, the forgery would be exposed in under 3 minutes. Grant was about to attempt to sell a multi-million-dollar fake to a room full of elite collectors, art critics, and journalists. Under federal law, specifically the statutes governing wire fraud and the interstate trafficking of counterfeit antiquities that constituted a massive felony, and Grant had just put his signature on all the auction paperwork. That was the public trap. The humiliation. Phase 2 was the kill shot, and it required a phone call. Silas booted up an encrypted sat phone I didn't even know he owned. He routed the call through a proxy server he had been maintaining since our first month in Maine. It was the kind of ghost network infrastructure federal intelligence agencies use when they absolutely do not want a conversation showing up on a telecom subpoena. Robert Hall's voice came through the speaker crystal clear. He had the same unbothered, slow cadence I remembered from the hospital waiting room. He started with the forensics. During the 2 years after Silas and I vanished, Hall had been quietly working back channels that Grant's expensive fixers couldn't monitor. He was building a bulletproof forensic murder case against Grant Vaughn for the death of Edward Sterling. The process had required a massive legal hurdle, obtaining a sealed court order for an independent laboratory to retest the biological tissue samples retained from my father's autopsy. It was a slow, agonizing process. If Hall rushed it and broke the legal chain of custody, a good defense lawyer would get the lab results thrown out of court before they ever reached a jury. The analysis had finally been completed 11 weeks ago. Hall read the toxicology conclusion out loud. He read it in the same bored tone a guy uses to read the terms and conditions on an iTunes update. The findings indicate the presence of a heavy metal compound in Edward Sterling's renal tissue. It is highly compatible with a class of toxic substances designed to accumulate gradually in the kidneys over a period of several months. The compound is colorless, odorless, and metabolizes in a way that mimics progressive natural renal failure unless specifically screened for in a forensic autopsy. The concentration found in the tissue is not compatible with environmental exposure or accidental ingestion. Based on the degradation rates, the introduction of the compound began approximately 6 months prior to the subject's death. I had to sit down. Technically, I was already sitting in a kitchen chair, but there is a physical difference between occupying a chair and needing times the chair to keep you from hitting the floor. Somewhere in the middle of that paragraph, I crossed the line. I placed both my hands flat on the table. I didn't look at Silas. I just stared at the grain of the wood and let Hall finish talking. When the line went quiet, I spoke. He murdered my father. It wasn't a question. The evidence is ironclad, Silas said from across the table. It's enough to trigger a massive federal indictment. Hall has been coordinating with the FBI's New York field office for the last month. They are fully prepped to execute the arrest warrant. But they want to do it at the Sotheby's Gala. Maximum witnesses, maximum documented impact. Zero opportunity for Grant to run to a shredder or a private jet before the cuffs click. I pictured it, a highly public federal raid in the middle of a black-tie gala, right in front of the billionaires Grant had spent years kissing up to, the donors, the gallery owners, the society journalists who would have no choice but to live-tweet the entire collapse. There would be no quiet conversation in a mahogany law office. No chance for his PR team to spin it as a misunderstanding. He was going to be dragged out in front of 300 people and a dozen high-definition cameras. My father had been a deeply patient man. He built sterling fine arts over 40 years using exactly this kind of structural, ruthless logic. Never make the fastest move. Make the Times checkmate, Times move. Then that's where we do it, I said. 3 days before the auction, Robert Hall formally submitted the master evidence packet to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The packet was a nuke. It included the forensic toxicology report, the flawless chain of custody logs, a mountain of financial audits proving Grant had been systematically embezzling from sterling fine arts, and finally the original Delaware Trust documents, proving Silas held the 40% voting proxy, which meant Grant had been illegally acting as CEO for 3 years. The FBI confirmed receipt. A federal arrest warrant was signed by a judge and placed on standby waiting for the gala. That night, after the house was quiet and Leo was asleep, I walked alone into my restoration studio. The heavy wooden box was sitting on the top shelf exactly where I had left it. I didn't open it. I just rested my palm flat against the lid. I stood there in the dark, feeling the rough grain of the wood, the same way I mapped the surface of a broken antique before I started repairing it. Feeling the history underneath. My father knew. He knew exactly what Grant was. He knew Grant was poisoning him, and instead of fighting a messy public battle he knew he wouldn't survive, he spent his dying months building an invisible, indestructible weapon that would survive him. He trusted Silas to hold the weapon. He trusted me to pull the trigger when the time was right. The time was 4 days away. I took my hand off the box. I turned off the studio light. I walked down the hall and peeked into Leo's room. He was fast asleep on his back, one arm flung out wide, radiating the absolute reckless trust of a child who has never had a single reason to doubt that he is safe. I went to bed. The planning was over. Tomorrow the execution began. The last time I left Maine, it was past midnight, and I was bleeding in the back of an ambulance, with no idea if I would live to see the sun come up. This time, I left in the morning. The sun was still low over the water when Silas backed the sedan out of the gravel driveway. The April light was sharp and bright, but the air still held a bitter chill. Leo fell asleep in his car seat before we even hit the interstate, his head slumped against the window. One of his tiny hands was locked in a death grip around the wooden toy car Silas had helped him sand down on the porch 8 months ago. I watched his reflection in the side mirror for a few minutes, the complete heavy stillness of a sleeping toddler. Then I looked forward at the highway. I had spent 3 years in Maine aggressively refusing to look in the rearview mirror toward New York. Today I was driving straight into its teeth. The sheer distance between the terrified woman who fled the city and the woman sitting in this passenger seat felt like an ocean. I looked at Silas's hands on the steering wheel, his right shoulder the one held together by surgical steel and sheer willpower, the one he massaged on cold mornings when he thought I wasn't looking, was completely relaxed. He sat with the loose, easy posture of a man who makes his living in high-stress environments and had long ago made his peace with the violence. I thought about the night I met him, a crumpled, bleeding stranger on a wet highway. I didn't know his name. I had no logical reason to stop for him, other than the fact that he was bleeding in my lane and I couldn't physically drive over him. Now he was driving me back to the city that had tried to bury me, and he was doing it with the same quiet, terrifying competence he brought to everything else. Like taking down a millionaire sociopath was just the next logical item on his to-do list. Leo woke up somewhere past Portland, blinking in the bright sun. He immediately started rapid-firing questions the way kids do when they refuse to waste a single conscious second being confused. "What's that?" he demanded, pointing at a concrete overpass. "A bridge," Silas answered smoothly. "Cars drive over it so they don't have to go around." "What's that?" "A rest stop. We'll stretch our legs there in a little bit." "What's that?" "That is a massive 18-wheeler. Based on the logo on the trailer, it's hauling paper products." "What are paper products?" "Things made of paper, napkins, cardboard. Probably the boxes your cereal comes in." Leo absorbed this data with intense academic seriousness, then immediately pointed at a water tower. "What's that?" I sat in the passenger seat listening to them, and I felt a very specific, sharp ache in my chest. It's the pain that hits you when something is so agonizingly normal right in the middle of circumstances that are completely insane. This was the sound of a Tuesday morning in a family minivan. A hyperactive kid asking endless questions and a patient dad answering them while the miles rolled by. And in roughly 32 hours, I was going to walk into a ballroom full of Manhattan's elite who firmly believed I was a rotting corpse. But not yet. For now there was just the highway, the overpass, and a truck full of paper products. We pulled over at a rest stop in Massachusetts. It was a low brick building with a food court and a fenced-in plastic playground out front. Leo sprinted straight for the jungle gym with the focused intensity of a commando breaching a compound. Silas and I stood side by side at the chain-link fence, watching him navigate a wobbly rope bridge, his tongue sticking out in pure concentration. After a minute, Silas spoke without turning his head. "You don't have to walk into that room alone tomorrow night," he said. "You never had to." I looked at his profile. He was still watching Leo. Over the last 3 years, Silas had become an expert at building careful walls around difficult conversations. He communicated in measured, tactical statements. He never gave away more emotion than the situation strictly required. But standing by a chain-link fence at a Massachusetts rest stop with the spring wind whipping my hair and my son conquering a plastic slide with absolute confidence, I didn't have a tactical response ready. I just nodded. He nodded back. That was the entire conversation. And it was exactly enough. We hit Brooklyn at 7:00 p.m. The hotel was small, strictly off the main avenues, and entirely discreet. Exactly what we needed. It was the kind of boutique establishment that processed cash payments without blinking and kept its hallways dead quiet. We checked in under the aliases Silas had maintained since Maine. Leo was asleep before we even got his shoes off, sprawled sideways across the hotel mattress, radiating total unconscious trust. I stood by the window while Silas settled into the armchair near the door. It was a habit I had noticed years ago. He always, without exception, chose the seat with his back to a solid wall and a clear line of sight to the primary exit. It wasn't paranoia. It was a reflex so deeply ingrained, it was practically muscle memory. Outside, across the black water of the East River, the Manhattan skyline was glowing against the night sky. I hadn't looked at it from this angle in 3 years. It looked exactly the same. Of course it did. Cities don't rearrange their skyscrapers just because you had a personal tragedy. The towers were still arrogant. The bridges still hummed with pale yellow light. But the woman looking at it wasn't the same woman who had left. I stood there and ran a mental diagnostic on myself, the same way I'd inspect a fragile antique before putting it under the drill. There was weight in my chest. There was a hollow ache that might have been leftover grief, or maybe just the scar tissue where the grief used to live. There was the high-wire adrenaline of someone who had been hiding for a long time and was finally stepping into the light. But what I didn't feel, I realized with sudden clarity, was fear. The blinding, suffocating terror that had chased me out of my own house 3 years ago was completely gone. It had burned away, and what was left in its place was something much colder and infinitely more dangerous. Silas's encrypted phone buzzed on the nightstand. He put it on speaker. Robert Hall's voice was brisk. The vase arrived at Sotheby's secure lockup. 3 independent intake appraisers examined it. All 3 verified the hidden repair. Grant's team has spent the last 6 hours scrambling to figure out where it came from, and they're coming up empty. The FBI field unit is staged and ready. The raid is a go for 7:00 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you, Robert, I said. Get some sleep, Caroline Hall replied. Tomorrow needs you sharp. The line clicked dead. I looked across the dimly lit room at Silas. He was watching me with that same steady, unshakable focus he had given me since the night he bled on my car seats. Measuring, grounding, not pushing. 7 p.m., I whispered. He nodded once. I didn't sleep much that night, but I need to be precise about why, because the distinction matters. It wasn't fear that kept my eyes open. It wasn't doubt, and it wasn't dread. It was the feeling of standing at the absolute edge of something massive. The split second before the final domino falls. When the work is done, the trap is set, and the outcome is so close you can physically feel the vibration in the floorboards. I laid in the dark and waited for the sun to come up. Morning arrived the way it always does, without asking permission, and without caring if you were ready. We killed the day inside the hotel room. Leo discovered that the carpet near the window was an acceptable racing surface for his wooden car, driving it in endless looping circles while making aggressive engine noises. Silas ran through the operational timeline one last time. I sat at the tiny desk and aggressively tried to think about absolutely nothing. At 4:00 p.m., Grace arrived from Manhattan. She had pulled a sick day from the ER without giving anyone an explanation. She walked through the hotel door holding 2 massive paper cups of black coffee, wearing the grim expression of a woman who has decided that sheer competence is the only acceptable response to extreme anxiety. She was staying with Leo. Silas and I were leaving. At 6:00 p.m., Silas parked the gray sedan exactly 1 block away from the Sotheby's Manhattan entrance. From the passenger seat, I had a perfect line of sight to the marquee. I watched the valets in dark jackets hustling around the circular drive. I watched the slow, arrogant procession of luxury cars dropping off guests whose jewelry cost more than the average American makes in a decade. I could see the massive crystal chandeliers glowing through the second-story windows. It was the exact, highly choreographed dance of a New York charity gala, where philanthropy is just an excuse to remind everyone else in the room how much power you have. 3 years ago, I would have walked into that building without a second thought. I knew the unwritten rules. I knew which cocktail tables to avoid, which gallery directors to flatter, and exactly how long to hold a smile before it looked desperate. I was raised inside that bubble. It was the water I swam in. Tonight I was sitting in a freezing car down the block, watching the aquarium from the outside. Silas flipped open a ruggedized laptop resting on the center console. The screen flickered, then split into a 4-way grid. The FBI had tapped directly into Sotheby's internal security feeds. I was looking at live, high-definition video of the main ballroom, the entrance lobby, the auction podium, and the secure staging room behind the stage. Right in the center of the podium, bathed in a warm, dramatic spotlight, sat the vase. Even compressed through a security feed, I had to admit the forgery was a masterpiece. The celadon glaze radiated exactly the right depth. The silhouette was mathematically flawless. Whoever fired that porcelain knew exactly what they were doing. I stared at the base of the vase on the screen. The camera angle couldn't quite see the bottom ring, but I didn't need to see it to know what was missing. In a ballroom packed with 300 of the wealthiest, most educated art collectors on the East Coast, people who staked their entire reputations on telling the real from the fake, I was the only human being alive who had actually held the original. The weight of that knowledge settled over my shoulders, not like a burden, like armor. Silas's burner phone vibrated. He glanced at the text. "Hall is inside," Silas murmured. "He says Grant walked through the east entrance 8 minutes ago." I shifted my eyes to the lobby camera feed. Grant Vaughn strode into the frame wearing a midnight blue tuxedo. I recognized it instantly, the exact shade, the aggressive cut of the lapels, the way it draped perfectly across his shoulders. He moved through the crowd with the slick, frictionless ease of a politician working a donor dinner. People literally turned their heads as he passed. He shook hands, touched elbows, dipped his head in faux humility. He was orchestrating the room flawlessly. He had always been brilliant at it. I watched him on the screen, holding my breath, waiting for the old terror to spike in my chest. It didn't. Instead, what I felt was the icy, absolute focus I only got when my scalpel was resting a millimeter above a priceless canvas. The moment when the diagnosis is over and the surgery begins, Grant vanished off the lobby feed and reappeared on the main ballroom camera. I exhaled slowly. I looked down at my hands. They were resting flat and completely steady on my thighs. They weren't shaking. Then 30 seconds later, Serafina walked into the frame. She came through the same east entrance wearing a dark emerald gown that 3 years ago I would have told her looked stunning. But tonight it just looked heavy. She was noticeably thinner. The color in her face was wrong. That manic electric energy she used to carry the spark that made everyone naturally gravitate toward her at family dinners was completely gone. It had been snuffed out. She walked through the lobby with the stiff mechanical posture of an inmate walking to the yard. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but she wasn't looking for anyone to talk to. She looked like she was searching for threats. For a split second, the camera caught her face straight on, and I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to hope for. She wasn't just unhappy. She wasn't times performing, times sadness for sympathy. She looked hollow. It was the specific bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a catastrophic mistake for so long that it has physically altered the shape of their face. I flashed back to when she was 12 years old, sitting on the floor outside our father's office, with her knees pulled to her chest, crying because she felt left out, but was too proud to ask to be included. She had always been the one who desperately needed to belong, and she had never known how to earn it without breaking something first. I had known that about her, and I hadn't protected her from Grant. Sitting in the dark car, watching her ghost walk through the lobby, I realized I didn't know what to do with that guilt yet. But tonight wasn't about guilt. Tonight was about consequences. The auction started precisely at 7:00 p.m. Grant took the microphone at the center podium. He projected that effortless, humble confidence he had spent years perfecting in front of bathroom mirrors. He talked about the legacy of the Sterling family. He talked about Edward Sterling's vision. He talked about the Sterling Dawn vase as a sacred symbol of generational continuity, and how deeply humbled he was to be its custodian in these trying times. He was eloquent. He was polished. By any observable metric, he held the entire room in the palm of his hand. I sat in a cold sedan a block away, clutching the encrypted phone, my eyes locked on the laptop screen. "You good?" Silas asked softly. I actually thought about it for a second before answering. My hands were still. My breathing was slow. That tight, coiled knot in my stomach that had been sitting there since Maine hadn't unraveled, it had sharpened into a spear. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it. At 7:14 p.m., a text from Robert Hall popped up on Silas's screen. Podium vase confirmed counterfeit by FBI contracted appraisers. Full documentation uploaded to the federal warrant file. All field units staged at exits. Awaiting your green light. I looked at Silas. He looked back at me. No dramatic speeches. No last-minute hesitation. 3 years of hiding. 2 years of building a forensic chain of custody. A fake vase currently sitting in front of 300 people who were about to find out exactly what they were bidding on. I typed a single word into the encrypted phone and hit send. Now, I stared at the laptop screen. Inside the Sotheby's ballroom, the massive digital projector screen hanging behind the podium, the one that had been displaying high-res glamour shots of the auction, lots suddenly went pitch black. It stayed black for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for a confused murmur to ripple through the crowd. Not long enough for Grant's AV team to react. Then the screen violently snapped back to life. But it wasn't showing a vase. The FBI Cyber Division had hijacked Sotheby's internal AV system 40 minutes earlier, using a technician who had embedded with the catering crew 3 days prior. The legal authorization for the hijack was baked right into the federal warrant, signed by the Southern District Judge. It was a perfectly legal, heavily controlled presentation of unsealed federal evidence executed at the point of maximum witness saturation. Every document flashing on that 70-foot screen was already logged in federal court. Every timestamp was verified. This wasn't a stunt. It was an execution. The first slide was an email chain. Sender Grant Vaughan. Recipient private logistics contractor. Subject transport agreement. March 2021. The dates perfectly aligned with the night of my crash. The language was corporate and sanitized the way arrogant men talk when they think they're being clever. Clear the lane. Ensure permanent delay. The final email in the chain displayed a wire transfer receipt for a massive six-figure sum, the cost of a heavy-duty truck, a burner driver, and a wet stretch of highway at 1:00 a.m. The second slide was the banking trace, showing the exact offshore shell company controlled by Vaughan Capital Holdings that paid the hitman. The third slide dropped like a bomb. It was the forensic toxicology report from the independent lab. It displayed the bright red federal evidence seal, the signatures of 3 medical examiners, and the unbroken chain of custody log tracing the tissue samples from Edward Sterling's autopsy to the federal vault. And at the bottom of the screen, highlighted in glaring yellow, was the medical conclusion: findings consistent with the intentional systematic administration of nephrotoxic heavy metals over an approximate 6-month period prior to the subject's death. The subject was Edward Sterling. The ballroom held absolute paralyzed silence for 3 full seconds. I counted them on the screen. 300 people in tuxedos and evening gowns, all reading the same horrific words, their brains desperately trying to catch up to their eyes. Then the silence shattered. It didn't build. It exploded into a chaotic roar of gasps, shouting and scraping chairs. Grant moved before the noise even peaked. He didn't panic. That's the detail that still haunts me. Even looking at him through a grainy overhead camera, I could see his sociopathic brain instantly pivot. He didn't freeze. He didn't run for the door. He stepped directly up to the microphone with the exact same authoritative posture he had used 10 minutes ago to talk about my father's legacy. He spoke right over the screaming crowd, his voice booming through the speakers. "This woman," Grant yelled, pointing a rigid finger straight across the room at Serafina. "Serafina Sterling came to me 18 months ago with an investment plan. The forged vase, the offshore accounts, all of it. She orchestrated this. I had no idea the artwork was a fake. I have been defrauded just like the rest of you." I watched Serafina's face on the screen. All the blood drained from her cheeks so fast I actually thought the camera feed had glitched. She stood completely frozen, staring at Grant with the shattered expression of a woman processing a betrayal so profound that her brain couldn't physically accept what her ears were hearing. He was feeding her to the wolves. He had always planned to feed her to the wolves. She was his emergency exit. Then Serafina's hand slowly reached into her designer clutch. She pulled out a small, outdated smartphone. She had been carrying that audio recording in her purse for 8 months. Not as blackmail. Not as part of a master plan. She carried it the way victims carry the only piece of evidence that proves they aren't totally crazy. I doubt she ever intended to play it in public. But Grant Vaughan had just screamed her name into a microphone and pinned a federal murder conspiracy on her in front of 300 witnesses, and some choices make themselves. She raised her chin. She walked 3 steps forward to the nearest VIP banquet table, slamming the phone down right next to an open tabletop microphone. She hit play. I thought about exactly when she must have recorded it. Some quiet night in the mansion when she finally realized, probably before I did, that Grant didn't keep people around once they stopped being useful. Grant's recorded voice blasted through the Sotheby's sound system. It wasn't a long clip. It didn't need to be. His voice on the recording lacked all the polished, practiced charm of his stage persona. It was the cold, flat, rapid-fire voice I had heard through the crack of the study door 3 years ago. The truck did the job times Grant's recorded voice echoed through the ballroom. The car was found wrecked on the shoulder. No body recovered. The police think she crawled into the woods and bled out. I'm not pushing the cops to dig deeper. The plan served its purpose either way. Caroline is gone. Serafina pulled her hand away from the phone and took a step back. She didn't look at Grant. She just stared at the floor near her shoes, her shoulders slumped like someone who had just dropped an anvil and hadn't figured out how to stand up straight again. I realized she was crying. I couldn't tell when she started. I just noticed the tears tracking through her makeup. She wasn't crying over losing Grant. She had processed exactly what Grant was months ago. She was crying because she was 30 years old, standing in a room full of people recording her on their iPhones, realizing she had just destroyed the only family she had left to protect a man who wouldn't even hesitate to ruin. Here, some things really never change. Silas's heavy hand dropped onto my shoulder, not restraining me, just grounding me. "It's time," he said. I looked at the laptop screen one last time. FBI tactical agents in windbreakers were already pouring through the main lobby doors. They moved in that terrifyingly calm, coordinated formation of men, executing a flawless raid. Grant had stopped talking. He was backing away from the podium. The ballroom was a chaotic mess of screaming billionaires, flashing cameras, and people tripping over chairs to get out of the way. I nodded. I popped the car door open and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The freezing April air hit my face. The roar of New York traffic, the sirens, the yelling, the massive chaotic hum of the city slammed into my ears after sitting in the silent car for 2 hours. I stood on the concrete for exactly one breath, feeling the solid ground of Manhattan beneath my heels for the first time in 3 years. Then I straightened my coat and walked toward the entrance. I had imagined this exact moment 1,000 times, sometimes in nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, sometimes on peaceful afternoons in Maine, sitting on the porch, looking at the water, imagining what I would say, how angry I would be, how I would make him bleed. But I never imagined this. Pushing open the heavy glass doors of Sotheby's and realizing that beneath the screaming, the flashing lights, and the panic, I felt completely, utterly calm. The noise hit me first as I walked into the ballroom. It wasn't the polite hum of a charity gala. It was the dissonant, ugly roar of 300 rich people collectively losing their minds. Under the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers, the room looked exactly how I remembered it, and completely alien all at once. I didn't immediately look for Grant. I looked straight ahead. I walked the way I was trained to execute a difficult restoration, ignore the surrounding damage lock onto the structural center, and cut a straight line. My heels clicked against the marble floor. One step, then the next. The screaming in the room began to shift as people noticed me. It didn't happen all at once. It rippled outward like a shockwave. People grabbing their spouses' arms, whispers turning into gasps, cell phones pivoting away from the podium and pointing directly at my face. I heard my name spoken, or maybe I just heard the sharp intakes of breath that shaped it. I kept walking. Robert Hall was already moving. He had positioned himself near the auxiliary announcer's stand on the left side of the room. He reached the microphone before Grant even had time to process the FBI agents closing in on the stage. Hall's voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel. "Caroline Sterling is alive and she is present in this room." The crowd went dead silent. Her identity has been verified through federal biometric records and matched against FBI databases as part of an ongoing federal investigation. She is the sole surviving heir and primary beneficiary of the Edward Sterling estate, operating in full legal capacity. Grant had frozen. He was standing about 30 feet away from me. I watched his brain short-circuit. It wasn't shock. It was a terrifying, rapid-fire calculation of a sociopath, frantically trying to figure out which of his lies could still save him. I could actually see the moment he convinced himself he could still talk his way out of this. He took a step toward the microphone. Hall didn't even pause for a breath. Furthermore, the Edward Sterling Family Trust is formally activated as of tonight. Caroline Sterling is confirmed as beneficiary, and Silas Thorne is confirmed as proxy trustee. The legal ramifications regarding the fraudulent governance of Sterling Corporation over the last 3 years will be handled by the federal courts. Those filings are already in the judge's hands. The ballroom was silent in the way a room gets silent right after a car crash. The damage is done, and nobody knows who is dead yet. Grant turned his head and locked eyes with me. For 3 years I had wondered what this exact second would feel like. Would I feel the blazing, triumphant high of revenge? Would I feel vindicated? What I felt staring at Grant Vaughn, across 30 feet of imported marble in a room he used to own, was absolutely nothing. It wasn't numbness. It was the complete absence of heat. I had been terrified of him. I had hated him. I had spent countless nights awake in a house smelling of sea salt, imagining his destruction. But standing here now, the fire was burnt out. I was looking at a dead man who just hadn't stopped breathing yet. I held his gaze. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. He moved first. I don't think it was a rational choice. I don't think the brilliant strategic brain that had kept him ahead for 3 years was driving the car anymore. I think it was pure feral instinct. The reflex of an arrogant man who had never been trapped in a corner in his entire life, deciding that if he just walked toward the problem, he could intimidate it into disappearing. He took 3 fast steps toward me. Silas stepped out from my left side. He didn't shout. He didn't put his hands up in a fighting stance. He simply stepped perfectly into the space between Grant and me and stopped. There was something profoundly terrifying about the way Silas stood. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a threat. It was just the absolute, unmovable physical reality of a brick wall. He wasn't an obstacle. He was the end of the line. Grant slammed to a halt. He looked up at Silas. Silas looked down at him with the cold, bored attention of a man who had survived war zones and had yet to find a single thing in this ballroom worth raising his heart rate over. The next 3 seconds felt like an hour. Then 2 FBI tactical agents flanked Grant from the left and right. It was a flawlessly rehearsed takedown. One agent clamped a hand down hard on Grant's right bicep. The other agent spoke in a crisp, booming voice that echoed off the marble walls. "Grant Vaughn, you are under federal arrest." The rest was just procedure. Miranda rights read loud and clear. Zip ties ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The agents physically spun him toward the service exit with the specific, heavy-handed authority of cops who are not asking for cooperation. The entire ballroom watched. 300 cell phones recorded every second. I didn't move. Silas stepped back, sliding out of my line of sight, so he was standing right next to me, shoulder to shoulder. He didn't say a word. I didn't either. We watched Grant Vaughn get frog-marched out of the room he had spent 3 years pretending he owned, and the only sound I made was a long, shaky exhale that I hadn't realized I'd been holding since I stepped out of the car. The room didn't empty out after the cuffs clicked. 300 elite socialites stood completely paralyzed, unsure if the gala was officially cancelled or if they were supposed to go back to drinking champagne. Standing right in the center of the madness, I felt like the calmest person in New York. The hurricane had passed and the wreckage was just settling. Grant was halfway to the exit doors, dragged between 2 federal agents. But he stopped. He dug his heels into the marble, twisted his neck, and looked back at me over his shoulder. And what came out of his mouth wasn't a legal defense. It was a desperate, vicious stab aimed directly at my throat. The boy Grant screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over the crowd. "Leo is mine. She knows he's mine, and she kidnapped him. I have the proof." He violently jerked his shoulder, trying to break the agent's grip, and nodded toward his jacket pocket. "I ran the DNA. I have an independent lab report, Mr. Vaughn." Silas's voice wasn't loud. It didn't echo, but it possessed a terrifying low frequency that caused the entire ballroom to instantly shut up. Silas casually tossed a thick manila envelope onto the nearest catering table. He didn't slam it down. He dropped it exactly the way a mechanic drops a wrench when the engine is fixed. "The test you're screaming about has 0 documented chain of custody," Silas said, his voice flat and brutal. "The source of the child's genetic material is unverified. The clinic you paid off is not federally certified for evidentiary procedure. Under federal rules of evidence, whatever paper you have in your pocket is legally classified as garbage." Silas tapped the manila envelope on the table. "The envelope on this table contains the results from an AABB-accredited independent laboratory. The blood draws were conducted under court-supervised protocol with a flawless chain of custody and have already been filed with the Southern District Court. Every single step is admissible. It confirms biological paternity of Leo Sterling, and it is currently sitting in a federal judge's inbox." Silas stared at Grant. No smirk, no gloating, just execution. "The federal court will decide what happens next, Grant. Not you." Grant stared at the envelope. Then he looked at Silas. Then he locked eyes with me. Whatever he was looking for in my face, a flinch, a tear, some microscopic proof that he had successfully hurt me one last time, he didn't find it. I was thinking about my 3-year-old son, currently fast asleep in a hotel room in Brooklyn, clutching a wooden toy car safely guarded by the fiercest nurse in Manhattan. That thought didn't make me panic. It made me bulletproof. The federal agents yanked Grant forward and shoved him through the exit doors. He didn't look back a second time. The entire ballroom exhaled at once. It felt like a physical drop in barometric pressure. Hundreds of people finally remembering how to breathe. Silas turned away from the table and looked at me. "You okay?" The last time he asked me that I was sitting in the back of an ambulance, heavily pregnant, covered in blood that belonged to him. I had nodded back then because nodding was the only physical action I was capable of. This time I looked him in the eye. I looked at him the way you look at someone when the war is actually over. "Yeah," I said softly. "I really am." He held my gaze for a second. Then he gave that single solid nod. The nod of a man who has confirmed the perimeter is secure and is ready to go home. I looked around the ballroom. FBI agents were cordoning off witnesses and taking statements. Robert Hall was standing near the stage, rapidly sorting through documents with his paralegal, operating with the ruthless efficiency of lawyers who know they aren't sleeping tonight. The crowd was slowly thawing out. Phones were being shoved into pockets. Whispers were turning into frantic conversations. Everyone knew they were standing inside the biggest scandal of the decade, and they were already practicing how they were going to spin their involvement at brunch tomorrow. I scanned the room for Serafina. I checked the VIP tables. I checked the lobby doors. I checked the corners. She wasn't anywhere. Through the massive glass windows at the front of Sotheby's, I could see the wet sidewalks of the city. Yellow cabs splashing through the rain, regular people walking by with umbrellas, totally oblivious to the absolute destruction that had just occurred inside. Serafina had run. My first instinct, born out of 30 years of habit, was to chase her. To run out into the rain, grab her arm, and try to force a messy emotional band-aid over a wound that had been festering between us since childhood. But then I remembered what Silas had told me during those first agonizing weeks in Maine when I kept trying to force myself to get over it before I was ready. Some truths are better approached only when you are truly ready to survive the answer. I dropped my hand from the doorframe. Serafina had just stood in front of 300 cameras and played the audio tape that burned her own life to the ground, just to put Grant behind bars. And then she walked out into the rain alone. That was her choice. Some distances close on their own timeline, but only if you give them the space to do it. I turned back to Silas. There was still a mountain of legal paperwork to sign tonight, and I was ready to start. I found my sister 20 minutes later. She hadn't gone far. She was standing under an awning, a block away, staring blankly at the wet pavement. She wasn't trying to hide, and she wasn't trying to hail a cab. She was just existing in the cold, like someone waiting for a bus that was never going to come. I stopped a few feet away from her. The streetlights cast an amber glow over the puddles. A delivery bike whipped past us, splashing water. A guy walked by, aggressively shouting into his AirPods, completely ignoring the two women standing in the freezing rain, staring at each other. I looked at Serafina's face. The sharp lines of her jaw were more pronounced than I remembered. Her eyes carried an ancient, hollow exhaustion that had nothing to do with the late hour. I flashed back to when she was a little girl. She used to cry hysterically every time our dad left for a business trip. On those nights, she would slide her tiny fingers under the crack of my bedroom door in the dark, just to make sure I was still sitting on the other side. I always sat on the other side. I always opened the door. I don't know exactly what year we stopped doing that. I just know we stopped. She spoke first. "I know there is absolutely nothing I can say right now," she whispered. Her voice was totally flat. No theatrical sobbing, no dramatic apologies, just empty. I didn't argue with her, but I didn't walk away either. "Did you know about Dad?" I asked. "Did you know Grant poisoned him?" A brutally long silence stretched between us. A city bus groaned past the intersection, its air brakes hissing loudly. "I didn't know until it was too late to fix it," she finally choked out. She looked away. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I looked her dead in the eye. There are micro-expressions people make when they are acting out guilt for an audience, and there are physical reactions the human face makes when the guilt is actually eating them alive from the inside out. What I saw on Serafina's face wasn't a performance. Did that absolve her? I honestly didn't know. And standing on that freezing April sidewalk, I realized I didn't have to figure it out tonight. Some questions take more than one conversation to answer. Some betrayals take more than a single apology to bury. We stood together under the awning for another minute, in total silence. Then she pulled her coat tighter, turned, and walked away into the city. I watched her until she disappeared into the crowd. Over the next few weeks, Robert Hall walked me through the legal fallout. Because Serafina had voluntarily handed the burner phone recording to the FBI before Grant was formally indicted, and because she had provided the offshore account routing numbers without demanding immunity, the U.S. Attorney's Office treated her as a cooperating witness. Under federal sentencing guidelines, a cooperating witness who provides explosive material evidence gets massive leniency. She was placed on supervised release, which meant she had to wear an ankle monitor, check in with a federal probation officer, and surrender her passport, but she wasn't going to federal prison. However, every single dollar attached to the Vaughn Foundation was seized by the government. She was broke, and she was going to spend the next 2 years sitting in courtrooms testifying against her ex-lover. I didn't step in to help her. I didn't write a character reference asking the judge for mercy, and I didn't call the DA demanding they lock her up either. I stepped back and let the legal system do exactly what it was designed to do. 6 weeks after Grant's arraignment, a plain white envelope arrived at a secure P.O. box that only Robert Hall had access to. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. The handwriting was Serafina's, the exact same slanted, careful cursive. Our father had paid a tutor to teach us in middle school. I am so sorry I chose him over you. I am sorry it took me so long to see it. Take care of Leo. There was no signature. There was no phone number to call back, even if I had wanted to. I read it twice. I folded it along the original crease, and I placed it in the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. I didn't throw it in the trash, but I didn't write back either. Some wounds can't be stitched closed with a single apology letter, and some bridges require decades to rebuild. I understood that. I assumed she understood it too. I pushed the desk drawer shut. I stood up and walked over to the sliding glass door, looking out into the backyard. Leo was sprinting in massive, wobbly circles across the grass, his arms thrown out wide like an airplane, laughing hysterically at a joke only a 3-year-old could understand. Silas was jogging 3 steps behind him. He was moving in a slow, exaggerated, lumbering trot, intentionally letting the kid think he was winning a foot race against a trained operative. The warm June sunlight spilled perfectly across the lawn. The muffled sound of Leo's giggles bled through the glass. There are deep, generational wounds that require years of therapy and silence to heal. I know that. But there are also things visible through a pane of glass on a random Tuesday afternoon that don't require any time at all to be real. I was finally learning how to hold both of those truths in my hands at the exact same time. The locked drawer in the sunny backyard, the unanswered letter, and the sound of my son laughing. One didn't cancel out the other. People think the story ends the second the bad guy gets arrested. There's no sudden flash of blinding light, no cinematic orchestra swelling in the background. It's just waking up on a random Monday morning, pouring a lukewarm cup of coffee, and listening to a toddler aggressively demand rabbit-shaped pancakes. Standing at the stove with a spatula in my hand, I realized this boring, chaotic, beautifully normal morning was the exact thing I had spent 3 years fighting for. Robert Hall had told me something profound the first time we met in person after the trial. We were standing outside a coffee shop on Madison Avenue, freezing in the wind, holding paper cups. "Your father spent 40 years building the sterling name," Hall said, looking at me over his glasses. "You get to spend the rest of your life deciding what that name actually means." I thought about that sentence every single morning when I opened my laptop. It didn't feel like a heavy expectation. It felt like a compass. Grant's sentencing came down in late July. wire fraud, corporate conspiracy, and a massive, unsealable federal indictment for the premeditated murder of Edward Sterling. He was going to die in a concrete box. The federal courtroom was eerily quiet when the judge read the numbers. I sat 3 rows back. I expected to feel a massive surge of adrenaline. Instead, I felt that quiet, settling peace that only arrives when something that has been profoundly broken for a long time is finally officially categorized as fixed. Sterling Fine Arts returned to my absolute control, triggered by the Delaware Trust my father had built. I didn't move back into the massive Sterling estate on the Upper East Side. I sold it. Instead, I bought a sprawling, messy, beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn. It had a massive backyard for Leo to destroy, and a detached garage where Silas set up a heavy-duty woodworking bench. The corporation still operated out of Manhattan, and I went into the office 3 days a week. I spent my first 6 months, quietly, ruthlessly, dismantling every single shady backdoor deal Grant had established. I replaced his cronies with aggressive, transparent board members who implemented the exact accountability structures my father had wanted but never had the time to finish. It was grueling, tedious work. I loved every second of it. Silas and I didn't have a singular, explosive, romantic movie moment. Our relationship was built on 1,000 tiny, boring, monumental foundations. It was built on nights cooking dinner together in a kitchen that smelled like sawdust from the garage. It was built on the nights I found Silas asleep, sitting straight up on the living room couch, because he had stayed awake until 3:00 a.m. monitoring Leo's cough. It was built on a random Tuesday night when I walked into the kitchen at midnight to get water and found this giant, scarred tactical operator hunched over the kitchen island, frowning at a massive textbook on antique porcelain, conservation. He looked up totally unashamed and shrugged. "I'm trying to figure out what you do." He wasn't talking about the corporation or the trust fund or the money. He was talking about the actual art. The grueling, patient, invisible work of taking broken things and making them whole again. That sentence stayed lodged in my chest longer than a love poem ever could. In November, right in the middle of a chaotic dinner, Leo slammed his plastic fork down on the table, with the grave seriousness of a CEO announcing a merger. "Dad," Silas Leo demanded, juice smeared across his chin. "Are you gonna be my dad forever?" Silas looked across the table at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us said a word to the kid. Leo simply picked his fork back up and aggressively stabbed a piece of broccoli. He seemed totally satisfied that the paperwork had been filed and the adults would handle the logistics. That night, after Leo was bathed and snoring in his bed, Silas walked into the kitchen and set a tiny velvet box on the granite island. He didn't make a grand theatrical speech. He didn't drop to one knee. He just set it down next to my coffee mug and waited. I opened the box. It was a white gold band. No massive, gaudy diamond. Nothing designed to impress other rich women from across a gala ballroom. It was the kind of ring that demanded to be looked at closely. I pulled it out and rolled it between my fingers. There was an engraving on the inside of the band. The letters were so microscopic I had to tilt it into the harsh kitchen lighting to read it. "Always, buddy." The exact words he had promised a terrified 2-year-old on a freezing porch in Maine 3 years ago. Silas looked at me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I am garbage at speeches," he said quietly, "but I am exceptionally good at showing up, and I fully intend to keep showing up for you and Leo for as long as you'll let me." I looked at the ring, then I looked at the man. 3 years ago, I learned the hardest way possible that some things look flawless on the outside but are completely rotting on the inside. And I learned that the real, permanent things in this world don't require fancy packaging. I thought about the man who carried my son to preschool on a shredded shoulder. The man who taught a hyperactive toddler how to sand pine blocks. The man who stayed awake through midnight fevers, and the man who intentionally drove a motorcycle into a moving semi-truck on a pitch-black highway just to buy a stranger one more day on Earth. I didn't say a word. I just held out my left hand. It was our first Christmas as an actual family. Not in the legal sense, the courts had officially finalized Silas's adoption of Leo weeks ago, but in the only sense I actually believed in, the family of people who actively choose to stay long after anyone else would have run away. Leo had finally burned through his psychotic holiday energy around 9:00 p.m. He was passed out face down on the living room rug, one hand in a death grip around the new wooden fire truck. Silas had spent 3 weeks carving in the garage. The Christmas tree in the corner was blinking slowly in the dark, casting lazy, colorful shadows across the ceiling. Outside the bay window, a heavy snow was falling over Brooklyn, not the aggressive, angry blizzard kind that shuts down airports, but the slow, heavy, silent snow that makes New York City feel, just for a night, a little bit forgiving. Silas and I were sitting on the floor, our backs leaning against the couch, each holding a glass of cheap red wine. No music, just the rhythmic times, tink-tink times of the radiator and the sound of our son breathing. I thought about the terrified, desperate woman from 3 years ago, standing in a dark hallway, a hand pressed to her pregnant stomach, her heart hammering out of her chest as she realized the man sleeping in her bed was trying to kill her. That night she had absolutely no idea that the worst, most violent night of her life was actually the first brutal step toward everything she was ever going to love. You never know that. You never know it when you're standing in the pitch black, terrified to take a step. I reached out and placed my hand flat against Silas's right shoulder, right over the thick, raised scar tissue hidden beneath his flannel shirt, the kind of scar that doesn't fade no matter what dermatologists tell you. He didn't pull away. "Does it still hurt?" I whispered. "Sometimes. When it rains." He turned his head and looked at me. "Why?" I just wanted to know. He nodded once and we settled back into the quiet. That was enough of an answer for both of us. I looked at Leo snoring on the rug, and I thought about what it actually means to restore something. It doesn't mean sanding away the damage so nobody knows it was ever broken. True restoration, the kind my father taught me, the kind I had practiced since I was old enough to hold a brush, means respecting the trauma the object survived. You don't hide the repair. You execute the repair with such love and precision that the scars become the most valuable part of the piece. Silas had a shredded shoulder because he drove a motorcycle into a truck for a woman whose face he had never clearly seen. He did it because he was hired to do it, sure, but he actually times it because he is fundamentally a protector. That scar wasn't a tragedy. It was a receipt. It was the most honest, irrefutable thing in this room. More honest than any FBI wiretap, any federal court document, any trust fund. It proved that when the sky fell, he chose to stand underneath it. I kept my hand resting on his shoulder. If God came down right now and told me I could rewind the clock, if I could erase the fear, the hiding in Maine, the fake IDs, the terror of standing in that auction room, I would walk out into that freezing rain and get in that car every single time. Not because the trauma was some beautiful philosophical lesson, but because every agonizing, bloody step on that road led me to this living room, to this rug, to this sleeping kid, and to this man reading antique restoration manuals at midnight just to understand how my brain worked. The snow kept falling outside. Leo grumbled in his sleep, rolled over, and threw an arm across the dog. The Christmas tree kept blinking. Silas reached over and placed his massive, calloused hand over mine. He didn't squeeze it. He just covered it. The way you place your hand on something you have absolutely no intention of ever letting go of. He didn't say a word. I didn't either. My name is Caroline Sterling. I am the heir to the Sterling Empire, and I am a restorer of broken things. I am the woman who ran blind into a March hurricane to save a son I hadn't met yet, with absolutely no idea how I was going to survive the night. I had walked through hell to earn the quiet in this room. It was enough. It was more than enough. Some nights I still stare at the ceiling and wonder times, if I had just stayed quiet in that hallway, if I had just played the good wife, would it have hurt less? And every single time the answer is the exact same. No, because silence isn't peace. Silence is just fear wearing a nicer coat. I don't have perfect Pinterest board advice to give you. But if you are sitting right now, staring at a closed door in your own life, If your stomach is in knots and you are terrified of what happens if you walk through it, please do not do what I did. Do not wait until the knives are literally at your throat to start trusting your gut. Trust it earlier. Move sooner. I'm not someone who talks about faith very easily. But looking back at the long, bloody road from that rainy highway to these Christmas lights, I truly believe there are things in this universe that cannot be explained by mere planning or blind luck. I believe God was standing in the exact intersections I thought were dead ends. Family betrayal rarely comes from strangers in dark alleys. It comes from the people sitting at your dinner table. The people who know your deepest insecurities and weaponize them while smiling at you. But dealing with that betrayal doesn't mean you have to burn the entire world down. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is just standing your ground, holding the receipts and letting the truth execute its own warrant. Most importantly, betrayal, no matter how deep it cuts, does not have the right to write the final chapter of your story. Unless you hand them the pen, I want to say this as clearly as I possibly can. True revenge isn't destruction. It's restoration. That's the part I really wish someone had told me years ago. This was my story. But what does yours look like? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to hear from you. If any part of this resonated with you, hit share and send it to someone who might desperately need to hear it today. And if you want to keep hearing stories about the messy, brutal, beautiful process of surviving, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for sticking around until the very end. It means more to me than you know.